A woman discovered a letter from 1940 under the wallpaper, and the truth about her family was more horrible than a nightmare. On a Friday evening, rain like a net covered the view outside the window. Isabel sat on the floor of her living room, covered in rolls of wallpaper and tools for repairs. It was her favorite part of any remodel, taking down the old to make room for the new. This evening, however, something had gone differently. As she was tearing the wallpaper off the wall, her fingers hit a hard corner. "What the hell is that?" she muttered, leaning closer. In front of her was a strange piece of paper that someone had obviously hidden between the layers of wallpaper. Isabel carefully pulled the find out, realizing she was holding something old. It was an envelope, yellowed by time, with the date, 1940. In the center of the envelope was a wax seal, almost obliterated but still respectable. She tried to open it, but the edges were already starting to crumble. Her grandmother had always said, "An old house is a chest of secrets." "I must have found one of those chests," Isabel murmured, trying not to destroy the envelope completely. When the letter was finally in her hands, she noticed the unusual symbols on the edges of the paper. The handwriting was crisp, old-fashioned. The content of the letter, however, left her utterly perplexed. "You can't wait any longer. They know. And if you don't stop it, the consequences will be catastrophic." What, they? And what exactly was it that needed to be stopped? Isabel felt her heart start to pound faster. The next day, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, she tried to put everything in her head. The house she had inherited from her grandmother had always seemed cozy to her, albeit old. Her childhood had been spent here, every room holding memories of fun days and nights when she and her sister played hide-and-seek. But now the house had become a source of questions. Who had left that letter? Grandmother? She wondered aloud, as if she could get an answer from the silence. Her husband, Raoul, only snorted as he read the paper. Maybe it was just something the old gossip columnist had written. "Calm down, Isabel, it's just a piece of paper." But it wasn't just to Isabel. She started digging through old family photos and documents. In one of the albums, she found a picture taken around the same time period. The photo is of her grandmother Lucia and an unfamiliar man in a military uniform. Grandma Lucia was a strict but kind woman. Her voice always sounded in the house like a radio in the background, quiet, calm, but full of life. She told Isabel stories about the past, but always avoided the subject of the war. Isabel once asked, "What did you do during the war?" Lucia was silent for a moment, then grinned and replied, "You are too young to know such things." Now, holding this letter and looking at the photo, Isabel felt that her grandmother was hiding something important from her. Isabel began to study the letter she had found. The words on the paper were written with anxiety, almost panic. She tried to decipher what was meant. They know. Who was they? She immersed herself in an online search, trying to find similar fonts, old documents, and even registered on an amateur historian forum. There were no answers, but her curiosity only grew. Another shock awaited her in the pantry. In an old toolbox she found a wooden key. It was engraved with the inscription, "Compartment number 8. What compartment? Where to find it? Isabel felt a mixture of fear and elation overwhelm her. Late that night, when the house was quiet, Isabel sat in her chair with the envelope and key in her lap. She wondered if she should even pursue this investigation. Raoul, noticing her uneasiness, said, You're turning this into a detective story. Wouldn't it be better to concentrate on the real cases? But for Isabel, this had become personal. She felt there was more behind the mystery than just an old letter. When she finally went to bed, a strange dream made her wake up in a cold sweat. She dreamed that she was walking down a long, dark corridor. At the end of it was a door with an engraved 8. "It's a sign," she whispered in the morning. Though Raoul only grinned, Isabel knew that her journey to discovery had only just begun. The next day, Isabel decided that she could not put it off any longer. She felt that the letter, the key, and her grandmother were all connected like pieces of a puzzle. But did she have the strength and determination to untangle the knot? The first thing she did was to go to the old neighborhood archives. From her childhood, she remembered her grandmother proudly saying that their house had been built on the site of the former headquarters. It had seemed like an interesting story at the time, but now that fact took on a completely different meaning. Headquarters for what? Isabel muttered to herself as she walked down the street, feeling the cold wind tickle her face. The archive building looked as if its time had stopped. Long hallways, the smell of dust and cracked wooden floors. A woman with a serious face sat at the front desk. "What can I do for you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses slightly. "I'm looking for any information about the house at 23 Solstad Street," Isabel said. The woman mumbled something, raised her eyebrows, and reached for a magazine. "Is this your family's house?" "Yes, it belonged to my grandmother." The receptionist looked at her strangely, but said nothing. A few minutes later, she returned with several folders. "Here's everything we have. But be careful, girl," the woman said with a mysterious note in her voice. Sitting at the table in the reading room, Isabel flipped through the documents. Most of them were ordinary: the house plans, the list of previous owners. But one document caught her eye. It was an article in the local newspaper from the year 1940. Her heart raced. The article mentioned one Lucia Gomez, her grandmother. The young woman, known for her active citizenship, suddenly disappeared after being questioned at La Plata headquarters. Neighbors claim she was often seen in the company of a certain officer Ricardo. Isabel felt goosebumps run up her spine. Was her grandmother involved with an officer? Why had she never talked about it? Document by document, article by article, Isabel learned more than she could have guessed. The house had indeed been used as a temporary headquarters during the war. But what attracted particular attention was the mention of compartments in the basement of the building. One of the documents described the structure of the house. The drawings showed several hidden rooms under the main floor. "That's just impossible," Isabel whispered, remembering how often she'd been in the basement. She hadn't seen any compartments there. Her thoughts were interrupted by the phone ringing. It was Raoul. "You've been gone all day again. What are you doing there?" he asked with a touch of irritation in his voice. "I'm at the archives. I found something interesting." Raoul sighed. "Okay, but don't worry about it. When you get home, we'll have dinner together." But Isabel could no longer think about food. Her mind was preoccupied with one thing: what was hiding in the basement of their house. When she returned home, she went straight down to the cellar. Raoul, accustomed to her sudden disappearances, only shook his head and went to watch TV. The basement was dark and dusty. She found an old flashlight, turned it on, and began to examine the walls. Her fingers fumbled for small protrusions in the bricks, as if something had once been fastened here. "There must be an entrance here somewhere," she murmured, holding the key in her hand. In one corner, she noticed boards that looked newer than the others. Prying them open, she discovered a metal door. Holy shit, she exhaled. The door was engraved, Bay 8. Isabel inserted the key into the keyhole and it fit perfectly. The creak of the door filled the basement, like an echo of the past coming to life decades later. Beyond the door was a hallway, narrow and dark. The walls were covered in mold and the air was dank. "This is clearly no ordinary basement," she whispered, taking the first step inside. At the end of the hallway, she came across a room filled with drawers and old cabinets. On one of the desks lay documents sealed in envelopes. One was signed, Operation Esperanza. Opening the envelope, she noticed that inside were lists of names. Women, men, children. Some of the columns were labeled, evacuated, missing, liquidated. Isabel felt her heart quicken. "Grandmother, what were you hiding?" she whispered, clutching the document. Suddenly there was a rustling sound from behind. Isabel turned around sharply, her heart sank. "Who's there?" she shouted, but the answer was only silence. She hurried out of the hallway, taking her papers with her. Back in the living room, she laid everything out in front of her with trembling hands. Raoul, seeing her condition, finally became concerned. "Are you all right? What's wrong?" Isabel looked up at him. "Raoul, I think my grandmother wasn't who she said she was." Throughout the evening, Isabel couldn't calm down. Her hands shook as she went through the documents she had found. Raoul sat beside her the whole time, trying to calm her down. But nothing was working. She knew that what she had discovered would change everything she knew about her family. "Can you explain anything at all?" Raoul tried to be calm, but his voice betrayed worry. "I don't know yet," she whispered, staring intently at the list of names. "There are hundreds of people here, and my grandmother was somehow connected to it." Raoul sighed. "It's just old papers. Maybe it was all war-related?" Isabel looked up. "But why was it kept in our house? Why didn't grandmother say anything?" Raoul wondered. "Maybe she was trying to protect you? Or to hide something that would hurt the family." But Isabel couldn't agree. She sensed this wasn't just a random find. The next morning, she decided it was time to bring in the experts. Her old acquaintance, Javier, worked as a historian and had often helped her in the past when she needed to sort through old documents. Javier was a man with a shabby briefcase and a cigar in the corner of his mouth. When Isabel called him, he immediately agreed to come over. "What have you got this time?" he asked, barely crossing the threshold. "It's hard to explain." "Just take a look," Isabel said, laying out the papers in front of him. Javier scrutinized the papers. "It's very interesting," he muttered. "Do you know that Operation Esperanza is one of the most secret episodes in our history?" "No, I don't know anything about it." "What is it?" Javier lit a cigarette despite Raoul's protests. "It was a program to evacuate people from the occupied territories. But it wasn't that simple. Some evacuees disappeared without a trace. They were said to have been used in experiments, or they were simply killed to get rid of witnesses." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. "And my grandmother was part of that?" "Perhaps," Javier answered, "but don't jump to conclusions. You need more information." Javier offered to go back to the archives, but this time with him. He knew how to look for information that was usually hidden from view. They arrived at the archive in the early morning. This time the woman at the front desk looked at Isabel with even more suspicion. "You again?" she asked. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Not yet," Isabel replied briefly. Javier confidently took matters into his own hands. "We need all the materials related to Operation Esperanza. And don't tell me you don't have anything." The woman frowned, but returned a few minutes later with a stack of documents. In one of the folders they found records of interrogations conducted at the headquarters on Sociedad Street. Among them were several entries that concerned Lucia Gomez, Isabel's grandmother. The witness claims that Lucia cooperated with Ricardo Alvarez to ensure the safety of some people. However, her involvement in the operation remains disputed. She was working with an officer? Isabel wondered. Javier frowned. That wasn't so unequivocal. She may have been trying to help people, but she may have been forced to cooperate with the authorities. Other documents mentioned some kind of contracts that Lucia had signed. What kind of contracts? Isabel asked. Perhaps they were agreements to protect certain people. Or conversely, betrayals, Javier said. Isabel felt her world crumbling. As they were about to leave, an older man approached them. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help overhearing. Were you talking about Lucia Gomez?" Isabel nodded. "That was my grandmother." The man sighed. "I knew her. She was a wonderful woman, but she kept a lot of secrets." Isabel looked at him carefully. "Can you tell me more?" The man shook his head. "This is not the place for such talk. Come to my house. I'll tell you everything I know." The next day Isabel and Javier went to the man's house. His house was on the outskirts of town. He introduced himself as Esteban. "Lucia was a hero to many of us," he began. "She helped people escape from the camps, hid children, rescued families." "Then why is there such a strange record of her?" Isabel asked. Esteban lowered his eyes. "Because sometimes, to save one, she had to sacrifice another." Isabel felt her breath catch. Sacrifice? She had to choose who to save. It was a terrible choice, but she was making it for survival. Back home, Isabel sat in silence for a long time. She pictured her grandmother, strong, determined, but forced to make such terrible decisions. Raúl tried to comfort her. "You can't change anything. But you can find out the truth and tell it to the world." Those words were her motivation to keep going. Now she had new questions. What exactly was Grandma hiding? Why had she never talked about her past? And was she a hero or a criminal? Isabel knew one thing: she wouldn't stop until she found all the answers. Isabel spent a sleepless night staring up at the bedroom ceiling. Esteban's words about Lucia being forced to choose between lives sounded like an alarm bell in her head. The thought was unbearable. How could one make a choice knowing that other people's deaths would follow? She turned to Raúl, who slept peacefully beside her. Her heart clenched. If I were in that position, would I be able to make that decision? She thought. By dawn, Isabel had made her decision: she must know everything. Not just fragments taken out of context, but the full picture. And if that required digging into the dirtiest secrets of the past, so be it. She called Javier again this morning. "We need to get back to Esteban," she said. "Are you sure?" "He's already told everything he can," the historian replied. "No, he's not telling us everything. I can feel it." Javier sighed, but didn't argue. They went to the old man's house again. Esteban met them in silence. His face was tired, as if he realized that this meeting would bring more pain than relief. "Are you sure you want to know?" he asked, sitting down in his chair. "Yes," Isabel answered firmly. Esteban closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to collect his thoughts. "Then listen." Esteban began with how he met Lucia. It was in 1942, when he himself, as a young man, lost his family and ended up in a displaced persons camp. Lucia was one of the people who helped us survive. She brought food, sheltered people when they tried to escape. Isabel listened with bated breath. But there were times when she had to make choices. Sometimes she was given a list of people to rescue, but in exchange she was required to turn someone else in. Javier frowned. She was turning people in? Esteban nodded. Yes. But it was never easy. Every time she cried, every time she tried to find a way to save more. But it was impossible. Isabel felt a tightness in her chest. And then what happened? Then she disappeared. They say she was accused of betrayal. But I never believed it. Esteban's story provided new clues, but left even more questions. Isabel decided to go back to the archives again, but this time to look for documents related to court cases of the time. The woman at the front desk was already used to her visits. "What are you looking for this time?" she asked with a weary sigh. "Anything from the trials against Lucia Gomez," Isabel answered. "If they exist, they'll be hard to find," she warned, but she began her search. An hour later, she returned with a small stack of documents. Isabel opened the folder with trepidation. The first thing she saw was the title, "The Trial Against Lucia Gomez, Accusation of Betrayal." Javier, who was sitting next to her, scrutinized each document. "It says here that she was arrested for collaborating with the enemy," he said. "But that's not true," Isabel exclaimed. "Perhaps, but there are witness statements that confirm it." One of the documents contained an interrogation report in which Lucia denied all the charges. "I did what I had to do to save as many people as possible," she said. She was trying to justify herself, Javier said. "No, she was telling the truth," Isabel objected. On the way back home, Isabel couldn't stop thinking about what she had learned. Her grandmother had been a heroine, but the world saw her differently. Why was this hidden? Why didn't my mom ever talk about it? She pondered aloud. Raúl, who was riding beside her, looked at her sadly. Perhaps because it was too painful. Those words hurt her. She remembered how her mom always avoided talking about the past. Maybe she knew, but she didn't want her daughter to live with that burden. That same night, Isabel received an unexpected phone call. It was Javier. "I found something important," he said. "There's another witness who might be able to help." "Who is it?" "His name is Julian. He was one of the children Lucia saved." "Where is he now?" "He lives in a small house on the outskirts of town." Isabel didn't hesitate for a minute. The next day she and Raúl went to see Julian. Julian met them in his small but cozy apartment. He was in his 80s, but the fire of youth burned in his eyes. "Lucia saved my life," he began as they sat down at the table. He told how he had been a child when his parents died, and how Lucia had sheltered him and several other children in her house. "She risked everything to hide us. But one day, she was forced to make a choice." "What choice?" Isabel asked. Julian lowered his head. "She could have saved us or given us away to another man. She chose us." Isabel felt tears come to her eyes. She was a heroine, she said. Yes, Julian nodded. But the world doesn't always see heroes as they really are. Those words stayed with Isabel all night. Her grandmother had been a hero, but her election had been overshadowed by a shadow of doubt and judgment. Now Isabel knew what she had to do. She had to tell the world the truth. After meeting Julian, Isabel could no longer just sit back and ruminate on the past. She now felt a responsibility to restore Lucia's good name. At the same time, she realized that any attempt to tell the story to the world might elicit a mixed reaction. People love black and white stories where the heroes are the heroes and the villains are the villains. What if the truth is more complicated? She decided she would start with local archives and small media resources. With Raúl and Javier at her side, she felt strong enough to move forward. The first step was to meet with a journalist from a local publication, Inés, who specialized in stories from the past. Isabel had contacted her through Javier, who knew her as a professional willing to dive into the most complex topics. It could be a grand story, but you have to realize that not everyone will accept it, Inés warned her at their first meeting. I know, Isabel replied. But I can no longer let this truth lie in the shadows. Inés nodded and picked up the notebook. Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything you know. Isabel talked to Inés for 3 hours, recounting all the documents, interviews and personal experiences. A few days later, the local newspaper published an article titled, Heroism or Betrayal? The Secret History of Lucia Gomez. The article provoked a storm of emotions. Some readers were moved by the story of a woman who sacrificed everything to save others. Others accused her of betrayal based on superficial conclusions from her past. It was expected, Javier said, showing Isabel the online discussion where opinions were divided. This is just the beginning, she replied. Unexpectedly for Isabel, the article caused conflict in her family. Her younger sister, Sofia, called her outraged. You had no right to bring all this up. She shouted into the phone. Why are you trying to sully grandmother's memory? I'm not, Isabel replied firmly. I want people to know the truth. What if the truth hurts more than a lie? Have you thought about that? This conversation had left a bitter residue. But instead of stopping, it only strengthened Isabel's resolve. Inés suggested expanding the research and finding more people who might have known Lucia or encountered her actions. Such stories are rarely one-sided, the journalist said. If she saved people, there must be other survivors who can attest to her actions. A week later, they found 2 more witnesses. One of them, Angela, had been a teenager during the war. Her parents were killed, but Lucia was able to organize false documents for her and her younger brother so they could flee the country. She was our guardian angel, Angela said in an interview. I wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for her. Another witness, Ricardo, was less optimistic. She saved some but sent others to their deaths, he said. It's a truth that's hard to accept. Those words rekindled Isabel's doubts. Raúl, who had been supporting her all this time, began to notice Isabel burning out. You don't have to do all this, he said one evening as they sat in the kitchen. But if I don't, who does? She replied. Raúl put his arm around her and whispered softly. Just don't forget that you're human too. It was at this point, when the pressure and doubts were at their peak, that Javier made an unexpected contribution. I found documents that could turn the whole story upside down, he said, showing an old folder. Inside was a list of names of people Lucia had saved, with signatures of the survivors. These signatures were like proof of her heroism, left by people who owed their lives to her. But there was another document. It was a letter written by Lucia shortly before her arrest. If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer here. I know that my actions may be condemned, but I acted as my conscience told me to act. Let not this world judge me, but another. These lines brought Isabel to tears. She felt she had finally found what she was looking for. Ines suggested organizing a press conference to present all the collected materials. Are you ready to tell this story not only to journalists, but to the whole world? She asked. Isabel sighed, but nodded. Yes. They began to prepare the materials, photographs, testimonies, documents. Every detail was scrutinized to the smallest nuance. The press conference gathered a lot of people, journalists, historians, just interested. Isabel stood before the audience with trembling hands but a firm voice. This is a story not only about Lucia, but about each of us. About how difficult times force us to make difficult decisions. She talked about how there is rarely one truth in a story. About how Lucia was a person who did the best she could in an environment where the choice between good and evil was blurred. When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. But even after this conference, there were those who remained doubtful. Could she really have saved more if she hadn't been so pragmatic? One of the listeners asked. Isabel smiled. Maybe. But we can't judge a man without having been in his shoes. These words became a kind of epigraph to a new chapter in Isabel's life. She not only restored her grandmother's good name, but also learned to accept the world as it was, complex, contradictory, but still beautiful. The press conference organized by Isabel attracted not only supporters and skeptics, but also those who stayed behind the scenes of the events. A few days after the event, a woman showed up on her doorstep. Her name was Carmen, and she looked like she had just stepped out of a black and white photograph. You don't know who Lucia really was, Carmen said, her voice shaking. You need the whole story. Isabel froze. She thought she had already learned everything possible. But Carmen was holding a shabby scrapbook that she said belonged to Lucia. It contained photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten personal notes. Each page added new layers to Lucia's image, how she smuggled people across the border, how she met secretly with representatives from both sides of the conflict. But one photograph made Isabel stop. It showed a young Lucia with a baby in her arms. On the back was the caption, "For Carmen. Love, Mom." Are you her daughter? Isabel asked. Yes, Carmen answered without looking away. But she's not who you think she is. Carmen began to tell how she grew up with another family, not knowing who her real mother was. It wasn't until after the war that she learned the truth. She was raised in a family that thought Lucia was a traitor, blaming her for the death of Carmen's father. Carmen began her investigation years ago, but she lacked the courage to publicly announce her discovery. She saved some, but her choices led to the deaths of others. I can't forget that, no matter how much I want to, Carmen said. Isabel listened with growing horror. Her image of the heroic Lucia was beginning to crack. Her grandmother was not only a victim of circumstance, but the creator of many difficult decisions that left deep wounds in the lives of others. Why did you choose to tell me about this now? Isabel asked. Because you're the only one who can tell the truth, Carmen said. I saw your conference. You know how to speak so that people will hear. After Carmen's visit, Isabel felt compelled to delve into the story even more. Together with Raoul and Ines, she began to revisit all the documents she had found. They discovered that there was a section of the archive that they had missed, the files related to the people Lucia had failed to save. Among those files were letters from people who accused her of betrayal. One of the letters belonged to a man named Daniel. He was Lucia's friend, but his family had been sent to the camp despite her promise to help. "I trusted you, and you let them die," the letter read. Isabel realized that her grandmother was not blameless. She was a person who lived in a world where every decision was a compromise. This discovery made her wonder, could a person in such circumstances even be judged? Isabel returned to Carmen with the letters she had found. Together they tried to reconstruct the sequence of events. Carmen, with her childhood memories, helped Isabel piece together the many small details. She often said that the choice was always between bad and worse, Carmen said. "I think she did her best, but sometimes there just weren't enough resources or time." Their conversations went on for days. Carmen gradually revealed her vision of Lucia, a woman who tried to fight but had to sacrifice parts of herself for others. While working with Carmen, Isabel found a hidden note in the album. In it, Lucia explained her actions in the last years of her life. This letter was different from anything they had seen before. It was addressed to those who would seek the truth. "I know that my actions will be discussed. Some will consider me a hero, some will consider me a traitor. But I did the best I could. History isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about who survives and why." These words became pivotal for Isabel. She realized that her grandmother wanted people to not only know her truth, but to reflect on the cost of each decision. Isabel and Carmen found Daniel, now an elderly man who was still living in his hometown. His memories of Lucia were full of bitterness, but he agreed to meet. "She destroyed my family but saved others," he said. "How can you understand that?" Isabel and Carmen listened without interrupting. Daniel spoke of his pain, but there was an undercurrent of gratitude in his words. He recognized that Lucia had tried to do the impossible in a world full of violence. "I will never forgive her, but I realized that she was just a part of this war," he said. Isabel decided it was time to tell the world not only about Lucia's heroic deeds, but also about her mistakes. Together with Carmen and Raoul, they began to prepare a new project, a documentary that would show the complexity of her story. This decision did not come easily to her. She knew she would face criticism and accusations. But she also realized that the truth is always more complicated than it seems at first glance. The movie was a huge step for Isabel. It showed Lucia from different sides, as a mother, a savior, a traitor, and a human being. At the end of the movie, the audience saw a quote from Lucia's letter. "History is not an answer. It is a question that everyone must answer for themselves." These words left the audience pondering. How do we judge people? What do we really know about them? And can we understand what it means to live in a world where every choice is a sacrifice?